Imagine you're surviving on like 13,000 pounds a year.
Right, a very tight budget.
Exactly. You're budgeting every single pound for your heating bill, uh, carefully measuring out your weekly groceries, just making sure the math actually works.
Yeah, living right on the edge of the spreadsheet.
And then out of nowhere, you get a surprise tax bill from the government that you literally cannot pay.
Oh, wow.
You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't hide any money. You tripped a silent mathematical wire that the government laid out for you.
That's a terrifying scenario.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are unpacking a really fascinating and frankly kind of concerning cascading economic phenomenon happening right now in the UK.
Right, a stealthy trap that's quietly catching millions of pensioners off guard.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. What are we looking at today?
Well, it's a profound shift. We're going to map out how this situation isn't just an accident. It's actually the result of a complex chain reaction. We'll be looking at what our source material terms the mechanics of envy, the invisible squeeze of fiscal drag, and a looming wealth exodus.
And how all of this is allegedly being driven by a class of policymakers we're going to refer to as insulated intellectuals.
Precisely. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, we really need to lay down some strict ground rules for you, the listener.
Yes, a very quick heads up. The documents, the historical texts, parliamentary debates, and economic blogs we're looking at today are intensely political.
Very much so. They pull absolutely no punches.
Right. They offer searing critiques of both left-wing and right-wing policies, historical figures, and modern politicians alike.
And our job here is strictly not to take a side.
Never. We are not endorsing any of the views, ideologies, or policies we're about to discuss.
No, we are simply acting as your guides to map out the fascinating arguments and the math contained in this material. Impartially.
Exactly. So, to understand the mechanics of the current UK economy, the argument in the sources starts by looking not at the factory floor, but at the classroom.
Right, the educational bubble that produces the people actually writing the rules.
Yeah, the research points a massive neon finger at Oxford University's PPE degree. That's philosophy, politics, and economics.
One of the articles literally calls it the degree that runs Britain.
Which is wild. But I have to challenge this right out of the gate. I mean, are we really saying an undergraduate degree is responsible for sovereign economic failure?
It sounds like a massive leap.
Yeah. How does a university syllabus actually shut down a factory or trigger an economic crisis?
Well, it is a big claim, but the connection they make is about the method of thinking it instills, rather than, the specific facts taught.
Okay, so it's a mindset thing.
Exactly. The critique is that the PPE degree was designed as a production line for the British political establishment, but it fosters a very specific, dangerous mindset.
Because the syllabus is so broad, right?
Right. Students are forced to frantically synthesize massive, complex topics, like the entire history of modern economics, into a short essay in just a few days.
So it basically trains you to skim.
Precisely. Dominic Cummings, a former government advisor, is quoted describing it as a system that encourages people to spread bad ideas with, quote, lots of confidence and bluffing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You learn how to sound incredibly authoritative about the surface of an issue without ever having to understand the deep mechanical reality of how it actually works.
You learn how to manage the spreadsheet, not the physical machine.
Exactly. It's the elevation of theory over reality.
Okay, I see the connection now. And what's fascinating is how the research draws this historical parallel to show that this kind of insulated theorizing isn't really a new phenomenon at all.
No, not at all. They look back at Karl Marx, and this is where the historical irony gets really thick.
Right, because Marx's entire intellectual revolution, his writings on alienation of the working class, were largely funded by what the texts call the Bank of Engels.
Friedrich Engels is the ultimate historical example of this paradox. I mean, while Marx was sitting in the British Library writing the foundational texts of communism.
He was being financially supported by Engels.
Right. But where did Engels get that money? He was a factory owner in Manchester. He managed his father's incredibly profitable textile mills.
He was basically the capitalist oppressor in his own theory.
Exactly. And he wasn't just managing the mills, he lived a life of high society. He rode with the Cheshire Hunt, engaging in this incredibly aristocratic pastime of fox hunting.
Wow, fox hunting while funding Mark.
Yeah, all while sending the industrial profits generated by his factory workers down to London to pay for Marx's rent and to fund his daughter's piano lesson.
That is wild. They were preaching a working-class revolution while being entirely insulated from the physical, brutal struggle of the working class.
Right. Their wealth acted as a shock absorber.
The ultimate champagne socialists, and the readings bring this exact archetype right into the modern day, pointing to Ed Miliband, the current UK Energy Secretary, as the prime example.
The modern insulated intellectual.
Yeah. Miliband is actually the son of Ralph Miliband, a famous Marxist theorist. So you have a policymaker who grew up in an affluent academic bubble in Primrose Hill.
Went to Oxford for that exact PPE degree.
And moved straight into political advising.
And the central critique here is that policymakers with this background have never had to face the mechanical reality of the industries they're regulating.
Right, they haven't faced the binary failure of a household budget.
Exactly. If you run a small business and the numbers simply don't add up at the end of the month, the business dies. There is no bailout.
But for the insulated intellectual, failure just means, what, a bad headline or a slight dip in the polls?
Yeah, their personal livelihood is never truly at risk.
Think about it like a pilot flying a passenger plane entirely via spreadsheet.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. They are sitting in the cockpit perfectly content because they're looking at the theoretical fuel burn and the altitude algorithms on their screen. The math says everything is fine.
But they never actually look out the window.
Exactly. They don't see that the plane is aimed directly at a mountain.
That is the exact friction point. Because when the theories of the insulated intellectual finally hit the mechanical reality of the economy, the spreadsheet crashes into the mountain.
And nowhere is that crash more evident than in the push for net zero and the energy sector.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because the data on the UK energy policy is staggering.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about a slight increase in the electric bill here.
No, we're talking about a structural disadvantage. UK industrial electricity prices for large users are now hovering around 22 to 25 pence per kilowatt hour.
Just to put that into a global perspective, that is drastically higher than the European Union median.
And it is practically another universe compared to a competitor like Saudi Arabia, where industrial rates are around 4 to 6 pence.
So wait, if I'm a manufacturer in the UK, my electricity costs 4 to 5 times more than my competitors overseas.
Exactly.
Explain exactly how that breaks the machine. Like, how does that 25 pence rate literally force a factory to close?
Well, it comes down to the physical threshold of profit.
Yeah.
If you're manufacturing steel or ceramics or chemicals, your profit margins are already razor thin.
Right, because materials are expensive.
Yeah, and energy isn't just an overhead cost. It is the primary ingredient in your product. When your core input cost quintuples, you don't just tighten your belt or find some efficiency savings.
The math fundamentally breaks.
Exactly. It costs you more to make the steel than you can sell it for. You cross a physical threshold where you have to shut down the furnaces, let the workers go, and close the doors.
And the broader economic result of that is that manufacturing in the UK has dropped to an all-time low of just 9% of GDP.
Which is a massive shift.
It really is. But instead of seeing these business owners and manufacturers as vital engines of the economy, the texts argue they are increasingly being demonized by the very people writing the policies.
This touches on a profound confusion in modern policy about the nature of wealth. The reading draws a very sharp, crucial line between two types of wealth: extractive wealth and productive wealth.
Okay, break those down for us.
Well, extractive wealth is the old aristocratic model. It's wealth gained through land seizure, armed force, and monopoly. It is taking a slice of a pie that already exists.
Or, as one of the authors bluntly describes it, relying on thieving and murdering skills.
Right, it doesn't create anything new, but productive wealth is entirely different. That is the entrepreneurial model.
That's the person who had an idea, took a massive financial risk, mortgaged their house, worked 80-hour weeks, and built a business from the ground up.
They created a new pie that didn't exist before. They generated jobs, supply chains, and enormous amounts of income tax.
The tragedy, according to the critique, is that modern policy treats the productive wealth creator as if they were an extractive aristocrat.
Yeah, they treat the person who took the risk to build the factory like a feudal lord who needs to be taken down a peg.
And because of this demonization, the UK is now facing what's being called a WEXI, a wealth exodus.
The projections on this are quite stark. They show the UK losing 500,000 millionaires by 2028.
Wow. And why should you, the listener, care if a bunch of millionaires move to Dubai or Switzerland? Because the top 1% of taxpayers currently pay nearly 30% of all income tax in the UK.
They are literally the load-bearing pillars of the Treasury. The text compared this legislative mindset to the Soviet campaign against the kulaks.
Now, the kulaks weren't billionaires or aristocrats, right?
No, they were simply peasant farmers who were slightly more successful than their neighbors. Maybe they worked a bit harder, owned an extra cow, or had a slightly better plow.
But the state labeled them as class enemies and systematically removed them.
And the result? The state destroyed the agricultural productivity of the country, leading to catastrophic famines. If you drive out the people who take the chances and create the productivity, you destroy the social capital of the country.
Think about a local bakery. If the government taxes the bakery owner so heavily or makes the energy costs so high that the owner decides to pack up and leave for a more favorable jurisdiction.
They don't just take their personal bank account with them.
Exactly. That owner stops hiring the local plumber. They stop buying their morning coffee at the cafe next door. They stop buying flour from the regional mill.
The neighborhood doesn't just lose the bakery. The whole microeconomy of that street loses its bread. It collapses the ecosystem.
And this brings us to the most brutal part of the cascade. When the wealthy leave, when the productive tax base shrinks, the state's massive spending commitments do not magically disappear.
No, they don't. The UK currently spends around £280 billion a year on welfare and pensions. That is a massive financial hole to fill.
So if the top tier of taxpayers exits the system, the state has to find the money somewhere else.
Right. The tax burden inevitably falls down the ladder, it hits the middle class, and eventually it crushes the most vulnerable people in society, the pensioners.
Which perfectly explains the controversy over the winter fuel payment cuts. The government decided to strip this vital heating payment from 9.2 million pensioners.
And the justification they used was incredibly telling. They deployed what's called whataboutery and the bogeyman of the millionaire pensioner.
Right. They pointed to the very rare, extremely wealthy retiree to justify taking support away from millions of normal people just trying to survive.
We can see the real-world impact of this in the parliamentary debate transcripts we reviewed. Blake Stevenson, a member of parliament representing Mid-Bedfordshire, shared some stark, devastating details.
What did he say?
He talked about constituents who survive on less than £1,000 a month suddenly losing £600 in vital winter support.
So these are people being forced to choose between heating their homes and eating dinner.
Exactly. Age UK estimates that 2.5 million pensioners living near or below the poverty line will lose this payment.
And to get that payment back, the government tells them they just need to apply for pension credit. But applying for pension credit requires navigating a bureaucratic maze of over 200 questions.
200 questions. Just imagine that.
Right. Imagine a 92-year-old with early-stage dementia trying to answer 200 incredibly complex financial questions just to get the money to turn the radiator on in January. It's cruel.
It is. But the argument here is that this isn't an administrative failure. It is a feature of a psychological mechanism called the politics of envy, or leveling down.
The shift in the moral framework here is deeply concerning. Historically, the goal of social policy was to lift everyone up to a baseline level of comfort and security.
But under the politics of envy, the goal becomes shared struggle. If everyone can't be wealthy, then everyone must feel the pain.
The readings highlight a fascinating internet debate with a commenter going by the name N-Body.
Yeah, that was a telling exchange. When confronted with the fact that modest pensioners living on just £13,000 a year were going to be taxed, N-Body argued that taking 20% of their pension is perfectly fine.
Wait, why?
Because, quote, 80% is better than nothing.
Okay, I have to derp in here and push back hard against that specific logic because it completely misunderstands how survival actually works.
That's very flawed spreadsheet logic.
There's an analogy in the reading called the engineering reality that perfectly dismantles this. If you are an engineer and you design a bridge to hold a specific load of traffic, but you only provide 80% of the required structural integrity.
That bridge doesn't mostly work.
No. It completely collapses.
It is a total structural failure.
Exactly. If a pensioner's absolute baseline fixed costs, heating, basic food, council tax, water require 100% of their meager income, taking 20% away doesn't leave them with 80% of a comfortable life.
It leaves them with 0% of a functioning household.
Right. You can't swim 80% of the English Channel and claim a partial success. You just drown 4 miles from the coast. Taking that 20% is a structural failure for that human being's survival.
That is the ultimate clash between the ideologue's theory and the engineer's reality. The insulated person looking at the spreadsheet views money merely as a social lubricant.
They think it can be thinned out indefinitely to achieve statistical equality.
Exactly. They completely fail to see the hard, physical thresholds of daily survival. And this politics of envy isn't just internet rhetoric. It is being executed right now through a silent, incredibly effective mechanical tax trap called fiscal drag.
Fiscal drag. The
Wow.
stealth tax. Let's break down exactly how this ambush works step by step because the math is a slow-motion train wreck for anyone relying on a pension.
Here is how the trap is set. On one side, you have the personal tax allowance. This is the amount of money you are legally allowed to earn before you start paying income tax.
Okay.
The government has frozen this allowance at £12,570, and they've mandated that it will remain frozen until April 2031.
Got it. So the tax threshold is a brick wall.
Exactly. On the other side of the equation, you have the state pension, which is legally required to rise every year under a policy called the triple lock.
Let's clarify the triple lock for a second. That's the mechanism guaranteeing that the state pension rises annually by whatever is highest out of three things: inflation, average earnings, or a flat 2.5%.
Precisely. It ensures the pension keeps up with the cost of living.
So the pension is moving up, but the tax threshold is frozen.
Right. For the 2026 to 2027 tax year, the full new state pension has climbed to roughly £12,548. That works out to £241.30 a week.
Okay, so if you look at the gap between the frozen tax threshold of 12,570 and the rising pension of 12,548, the pensioner is left with a safety margin of just £22 for the entire year.
£22.
If you find a 20-pound note on the sidewalk, you suddenly become a taxpayer.
And here's the truly devious part, the gross payment trap. When the Department for Work and Pensions pays out the state pension, they pay it gross.
That means they do not deduct any tax before they send the money to the pensioner's bank account.
Right. This is the mechanism of the ambush. The pensioner receives their survival money, and they spend it. They buy their groceries, they pay their heating bill.
Because they think it's theirs to keep.
Exactly. They're completely unaware that if they have even a tiny secondary income, maybe a small widow's pension, or a few pounds of interest on a lifetime of modest savings, they have crossed that 12,570 threshold.
Wow. While they are spending their pension on basic survival, they're quietly accumulating a hidden debt to HMRC, the tax authority.
The reading gives a heartbreaking example of this with Pensioner A. Because of historic contributions under an old system, Pensioner A has a protected payment that brings their total state pension to £13,689.
Okay, so because the tax threshold is frozen, Pensioner A is over the limit by about £11,119.
Right, so out of nowhere, they are hit with a surprise tax bill of over £223.
And how does HMRC get that money? They claw it back by targeting the pensioner's other meager savings.
They use the private savings as a collection bucket to tax the state pension. And this math guarantees a massive looming crisis. We are approaching the 2027 tipping point.
Because the threshold remains frozen until 2031, but the pension continues to rise.
Exactly. By April 2027, the standard pensioner receiving just the basic state pension will cross that 12,570 line automatically.
Millions of people whose only income is a state benefit designed specifically for basic survival will suddenly become taxpayers by mathematical accident.
They are quite literally taxing the floor. The government is operating on the assumption that survival income is a luxury that can be redistributed.
And when people push back against this, when they point out how incredibly damaging it is to tax an elderly person's survival budget, how do the defenders of these policies respond?
Well, according to the texts, they deploy historical grievances to block any fixes.
This is a critical tactic to understand. When challenged on the morality of taxing a pensioner surviving on £14,000, the defenders will immediately pivot. They will say, but what about the millionaires?
Or, more commonly, they will use the WSPI women as a counterargument.
Just to give you some context, the WSPI women are a group of women who suddenly found out they had to wait an extra several years, sometimes up to 19 years, to receive their state pension.
Because the government equalized the retirement ages between men and women.
Right. It was a massive, unexpected shock to their life plans.
It was a genuine hardship. But the policymakers used that historical injustice as a moral cloak to justify present-day cruelty. They argue, because the WSPI women suffered in the past, it's only fair that today's pensioners suffer the tax burden now.
As the readings point out, if every mathematical policy fix for the present is held hostage by a grievance from the past, nothing ever gets fixed. It is a recipe for permanent sovereign stagnation.
It's a rhetorical trick to avoid answering the awkward question of why a 90-year-old is getting a £223 tax bill they can't pay.
They frame the argument so that if you oppose the stealth tax, you are somehow against social justice or dignity. But the reality is exactly the opposite. Taxing the survival budget of the elderly is what destroys dignity.
The authors call this the salami slicing of dignity. The state pits different groups, the young against the old, the waspy-eyed women against the current retirees fighting over crumbs.
While the state quietly takes a slice from everyone to fund that £280 billion welfare bill.
And that brings us full circle to the core thesis of our deep dive. A society requires massive revenue to function.
But by demonizing the productive wealth creators, the entrepreneurs who build the businesses and generate the primary tax revenue, the state drives them away in a wealth exodus.
Right. Then, to fill the massive financial void left behind, the state is forced to use silent, mechanical stealth taxes like fiscal drag to squeeze the middle class.
And eventually crush the baseline survival budget of the pensioners. It is the ultimate race to the bottom. The only equality being offered is an equal share of the struggle.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So let's recap the journey we've mapped out today. We started in the insulated, highly theoretical bubbles of university degrees like Oxford PPE, where sweeping policies are drafted by people who have never had to balance a desperate household budget.
We watched those spreadsheet theories hit the mechanical reality of the physical economy, driving energy costs sky high.
And sparking an exodus of the very wealth creators who fund the system. And finally, we saw exactly where the bill for all of this inevitably lands squarely in the lap of the pensioner, trapped by a silent mathematical ambush while just trying to keep the lights on.
The relevance to you, whether you're managing a small business, saving for your own retirement, or simply observing the political landscape, is profound.
It really is a wake-up call.
This entire cascade is a masterclass in how ideological spreadsheets can quietly override the mechanical reality of daily life. It highlights the immense danger of policies that prioritize the optics of theoretical fairness over the actual physical load-bearing capacity of a human life.
It's about recognizing when the gauges on the machine are screaming in the red, but the pilot is ignoring them because their spreadsheet says the altitude is fine.
Well said.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We've seen the mechanics of how the politics of envy punishes a society's most productive risk-takers and simultaneously taxes the absolute survival floor of its elderly. If a society continually prioritizes taking from those who build over protecting those who struggle, does it inevitably run out of other people's money?
That's the big question.
And in doing so, is it ultimately just managing its own sovereign decline, flying blindly into the mountain while insisting the math is perfectly fine?
It is the critical question of our time, and one that requires us to look past the rhetoric and examine the actual mechanics of the engine.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the spreadsheet.